So, uh, we will begin. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for attending this webinar on the assessment of the Pact for the Future of the United Nations. I'm really glad that we're having great speakers. I will present them just in a while. I want to thank them all to be here. And also I want to thank Claudia Castro from the Fundipau, which has helped with all the technical issues, details, and making it available for you to see all this webinar. I would also like to thank Albert Caramés, which is the former director of the Fundipau. He was the person that initiated and designed this webinar. So I want to thank him as well for it. Now, focusing on what we are going to listen and what we are going to speak about for this next 90 minutes. Nowadays, it's quite a commonplace to speak of United Nations as a crisis or linked to crisis in all general terms. It's certainly true. I agree with that. But also, I would say that on the original term of crisis, we have the notion of a crucial election, of a moment of election, rather than just a moment of risk. It's a moment of risk, but also it's a moment of opportunity. So that in some way obliges to not surrender and keep thinking that we can be able, or we should increase our efforts for making the world a more peaceful place. I think it's an idea that all our speakers will share with me and will be agreeing with that. It's an idea that comes also linked with the mission of Fundipau since its origins back in 1983. It has always understood peace as a result of many different elements, but obviously one of them has to do with multilateralism and efforts on the nations getting together, getting to agree, getting to discuss, getting to debate, but also reaching agreements as the one that we have today, the Pact for the Future, with its challenges, with its maximum goals, but also with its difficulties. In this sense, from Fundipau, we've been working on the last almost 50 years on many different networks related with United Nations work. ICAN, Control Arms, Stop Killer Robots, Cluster Munition Coalition, International Peace Bureau are only a few of these examples in which Fundipau has tried to contribute, even on small, humble terms, but contribute to a more peaceful world and also on a very multilateral way. In this sense, we have also had a great and fruitful collaboration with CIPRI. We will have one speaker from CIPRI today, almost 20 years translating their summary of their annual publication that we probably all have sometime or another, in my case, many others, read and used and profit a lot. So now we will present the three persons that will be speaking. These are three experts on different areas, but all related in some way or another to the issue we're going to speak about today. And first, we will have Gabriel Garrum. He's patron of the Fundipau. He's also lecturer of international relations in the Department of International Law on the Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona. So thank you very much, Gabriel, for being here with us. Also, we will have Daniel Forti from International Crisis Group, also a very valuable institution. In this case, they publish a lot of works related with conflicts, armed conflicts, and in my case, again, I've used a lot all your analysis on very different occasions. He's a senior analyst and he's expert on youth advocacy and research. And on the last term, we will have Gretchen Baldwin. She's senior researcher on peace operations and conflict management program at CIPRI, which goes for Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. In case you're interested in disarmament, read their annuary, or else you can read the small summary that we publish every year, translated to Catalan and Spanish. So now we will have them speaking for about 15 minutes. Then I will try to suggest them to intervene maybe on commenting some of the other people's talk. And then at the end, we expect to have time for you all to present questions and hopefully answers on issues that you might want to know related with the issue we're having today. Thank you very much again, especially to Daniel, Gretchen, and Gabriel. Please let us hear now, Gabriel, ideas on what's the world looking like lately, and in general terms, what's international relations going to. Thank you, Gabriel.
Thank you, Pablo, for the invitation. Thank you, Fundipao, for organizing this as well, and it's a pleasure to be here debating and chatting with Daniel and Gretchen on these topics. Now, how does the world look like? I mean, I guess every one of us is watching and seeing how the world looks like right now, and it's a, of course, gruesome picture of several dimensions. So we've been trying to catch up on this and trying to think around this idea of a fractured world, if you want to say so, in international relations faculties. And of course, I will not be dealing here with stuff that you guys have not touched upon or thought about, or even all the people watching this webinar have not thought about, which is that we're living in a moment where the international order that was created, that erupted, that was originated in the aftermath of the Second World War, is evidently in a situation that is much different than what it used to be. And again, I was saying that in international relations faculties and elsewhere in academia, I assume, we're trying to go around this idea because it's literally true. And we're trying to find the correct diagnosis, and I use the columns for correct because there's no correct diagnosis. There are many diagnoses, trying to understand the moment we're living in. So what I'm going to try to do in this 10-15 minutes is very simply to think about these diagnoses, at least lay them out on the table. I mean, again, I'm sure I'll be missing a few, but I guess the most important ones that will come through. Try to think about the symptoms of this moment, and many of them are very evident to all of us, and especially those working in not only international relations in an academic way, but also as practitioners and people more engaged with either peacekeeping or the management of violence or the management of international organizations. We see that very evidently. And finally, just some musings on where are we going, or where should we go, and that at least will bridge the conversation towards the UN, which is the idea. So I'll try to deal with the more general stuff for the moment, at least to settle down the conversation. So as I was saying, I mean, what we're trying to think about here is what has been called in many ways, but we can call the demise of the liberal international order. And of course, the term liberal international order gives a certain sense of what we're talking about, or at least the kind of institutions, norms, behaviors, expected socialization, expected discourses that we have seen since the end of the Second World War. And in engaging this idea of the trajectory of the liberal international order, there are many diagnoses for the current moment. I'm going to give three, then I think that summarize nicely the different debates. Now, the first one is what hardcore liberals understand as not the breakdown of this liberal international order, but rather a moment of potential reform and a moment of transformation, right? The same way that other institutions or other international mechanisms have not been destroyed and superseded by something else completely different. The argument here is that we're living in a moment that, yes, is seeing some transformations, some of them very profound and very worrying, but at the same time, we are seeing the transformation rather than complete breakdown, right? It's more an erosion of some liberal tenet and some liberal concerns that are by no means, let's say, the end of the world order, the international order as we understand. Thinking here of Eikenberry and many other liberals that set the conversation in those terms, saying, look, yes, we are in crisis in many ways. Yes, there are several norms and institutions and behaviors that we adopted some decades ago. But the fact that we're living throughout this moment of turbulence does not mean that we are going somewhere that is a worse place or that the liberal international order is completely superseded, destroyed, fractured altogether. Now, this is one way of looking at it. There's another way of looking at it that says more or less the opposite, which is the liberal international order is not only an erosion, but actually has been in a state of breakdown for the last years. And we see this through many processes. We see this in the complete demise of multilateralism, or at least the lack of belief in multilateralism in many locations. We see that in the disregard of United Nations. We see in the increasing illiberal mechanisms to manage conflict. So illiberal conflict management, or authoritarian modes of conflict management in several places. And therefore, we're going towards a moment of geopolitical power competition, full stop, right? A sense of a revival of the kind of empire versus empire moment of power politics, where all the things that made up the liberal international order, those connective tissues, those institutions, those norms, those values, those discourses, have been obliterated. Now, these two, as you can see, put the conversation into very different positions. Now, there's a third one that I've always been very sympathetic to, and I've been trying to think about it. And I think it touches upon many interesting aspects, at least for this conversation. Now, you might have seen Antonio Gramsci's quote of the old world is dying, the new one is not born yet, and we're living in a moment of monsters and turbulences. Now, this can be a bit teleologic, right? In the sense that it seems that we're moving always towards something of the new, and that's not always the case, right? But there is a specific version of this that I find more interesting, which is the idea that we're living in multiple international orders at the same time. So that the idea that the liberal international order was the one and only that encapsulated all the countries in the world, and that all those countries, either by acceptance, belief, or coercion, were integrated and were, let's say, englobed in this so-called world order, right? And I say belief, interest, or coercion because this is a very evident post-colonial critique, right? Instead of guaranteeing emancipation, we see that also in the debates in the United Nations regarding the financial system, right? And the institutions that have to guarantee development and financial independence. Instead of emancipation, we were somehow pushed into this kind of liberal international order. So this argument says, and of course I'm borrowing here the term from Professor Acharya, the idea that we're living in a kind of a multiplex world order, one that you can see in which you can find several orders at the same time. Now there is the multilateral, liberal, UN-centered order. It's there. Has not been demised, has not been superseded. It's in crisis in many respects. but it's not obliterated. We're still debating about it. We still have the United Nations. We still care about it. We still think about multilateral institutions. We still think about norms. At the same time, though, we're seeing other international orders emerging or competing with that. And in some cases, these are more powerful, unfortunately, than the very UN-centered order. Yes, we're seeing power politics being renewed. We see that in security and conflict management very evidently. Think about Nagorno-Karabakh, think about Syria, think about other places in the world that have been managed through illiberal mechanisms, through displacement rather than comprehensive programs. And that, of course, gives us a very grim understanding of security and conflict management. And at the same time, we're seeing actors that were thought to be the periphery of the liberal world, and of course, they're not the periphery, trying to articulate other international orders. Now, there's a Chinese international order very evidently rising, pushing, developing also its own normative institutions. And that's very interesting. We tend to forget from international relations department, especially in the West, that the Chinese international order, it's also normative development. It's not only about Belt and Road Initiative, let's put money somewhere and let's securitize. There's a part of that, of course, but there's also development of certain normative component, which is also important. And you see India, you see Turkey pushing at least for some regional versions of that order, putting certain values and certain goals at the center. So in this idea of multiplexity, you see how these different international orders are sometimes overlapping, sometimes agreeing, and sometimes disagreeing very strongly. So what we're seeing is that the floor of disagreement, if we go back to our global liberal international order, the floor of disagreement is higher. It's very difficult to completely agree and profoundly agree on central topics. We see this in the multilateral conversation we're having in the UN, but also in other matters. Right? It's easy to put people on board when the consensus is shallow. The very moment we're putting content, proper content, into these agreements, then a united understanding is far more difficult, right? So we're seeing these effects in many, I would say, in all of the institutions of the international order, from the organizations per se, the multilateral organizations, the UN, but also in collective security. Have a look, of course, at the cases of Gaza, of Ukraine, and many others, crisis in Sudan, conflict management in Nagorno-Karabakh and elsewhere. We're seeing as well in how and I'm using the term global South, but understanding all the fractures of the global South and all the complexity of the global South. But we're seeing also how these various countries are trying to sometimes buy, sometimes contest, sometimes join, sometimes reform some of the institutions. Now, there are moments where we are seeing what we expected to be the classic liberal countries defending the opposite of liberalism and multilateralism. And we're seeing countries in the supposed periphery of the world actually defending multilateralism. So we're seeing some countries of the global South, not all of them and not always, but saying, look, we need these multilateral forums also for us because we're trying to advance our own agendas and our own world visions. We're seeing an increase in authoritarian politics and authoritarian discourses. That's very evident. Have a look, for instance, at how Donald Trump addressed the General Assembly, the terms, the behaviors, the discourses. And we shouldn't forget as well that when we're thinking about the international, we also need to think all the time the domestic. Now, this separation between the domestic and the international is a fiction. It's a liberal fiction, to be precise, and it's an incorrect fiction because we cannot, let's say, disentangle domestic and international. We cannot understand the increase in authoritarian politics in international forums without thinking about the increase in authoritarian politics in domestic forums. So to finish and to conclude, where are we now in this precise moment of overlaps of international orders, where the multilateral order, the UN-centered order, is trying to find new compasses for, managing, but also recapturing some of the lost credibility for very obvious reasons. But at the same time, we still need it. Right? So we're in this moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. Very interesting. Lots of reflection, thoughts, and some contradictions that are shown on the international arena, as you have explained. I don't know to what extent, Daniel, you can see those contradictions being introduced on the Pact for the Future, or to what extent you can see on the one or another order. What's your opinion? What are the main features of this very interesting document?
No, thank you so much, Pablo. Great to be here and to speak alongside such esteemed colleagues. Gabriel, you did me a good service by walking through the state of the world, so I can cut a few minutes off of my initial remarks. But also just to make very clear, what's so fascinating about being close to the UN in New York is that you see all these contradictions manifest in everyday diplomacy on items large and small. So, in some ways you say that, there is a trend of the liberal order as represented through the UN and multilateral cooperation sort of being eroded or tested. But that's always been the case. That's the entire part of the UN, to bring every country and their worldview into a single common forum, and to have a place where everyone can push these interests and advocate for their own worldviews on somewhat level footing. And I think that's why the exercise that took place last year and brought us the Pact for the Future was such an interesting moment in time. Let me put it that way, because I think that's my first point. The Pact for the Future reflects a particular moment in time, and we are now past that moment, for better and unfortunately for worse. The exercise last year, it was very important to have 192 member states really come together and push for the understanding that there does need to be some list of global priorities across every area of the international domain, whether on development, whether on peace and security, whether on disarmament, you name it. Every major agenda item of global cooperation was covered under the Pact for the Future. I say 192 countries were involved because at the very last minute, Russia attempted to tank the process entirely and discredit it. So, even though they participated in some of the negotiations, the fact that they attempted to cut its legs out before the vote was even held to adopt the declaration for the Pact for the Future shows again, the competing worldviews and order that we're facing. But to be very frank, we've just completed the 2025 high-level week and the meeting of the General Assembly. And not that it's too surprising, but it was quite evident that, as my colleague Richard Gowan said, the Pact for the Future is better understood as a pact of the past. We are in a very different moment, even just 365 days later from when the Pact for the Future was signed last year. Obviously, the changes that have taken place in Washington, D.C., and the ripple effects and the shockwaves that's had on the UN system, not only on the specific agenda items, which I can go through in various detail, but more importantly, the health of multilateral cooperation and the health of the institution that is the UN, both in political spirit, but also in operations and financial terms, is a world away from what it had been even under an era under US President Joe Biden that had often contentious relationships with the global body. But now the fact that you have the current US administration saying things like, we don't support the Sustainable Development Goals, which are non-binding commitments because that is global government that we refuse to let Americans be imposed under, shows that any kind of initiative such as the Pact for the Future is not of this moment. It's not of a moment where you have great powers coming together and at least identifying priorities that they agree are important to work on, yet alone how the rest of the UN membership, which are countries of all shapes, sizes, interests, peoples, value and want stronger multilateral cooperation on global public goods. Two particular points. First is that there were lots of challenges even in September 2024 about how to take the Pact for the Future forward. And these challenges are only harder today. For example, the document, which I'm sure many of us have looked through, issues no degree of prioritization, no understanding of binding commitments, no sense of how member states would even own or follow up on the commitments they made in this declaration. And that is a challenge that becomes even harder today. In addition, the financial crisis that the organization is now facing, which is forcing every part of the UN system into even more considerable, retrenchment, and what that means for how the UN must do its existing work with less resources, who will lose out and where will they lose out. And this will unfortunately be civilians and conflict situations first and foremost. It's not going to be the governments that are making these decisions that are the ones that suffer most. That challenge becomes even harder when you look at all of the forward-looking commitments that are listed in the Pact for the Future. So it really, I was struck last week, but not surprised, that I don't think I heard the Pact for the Future be referenced once among major speeches, among world leaders, even in the side events that take place alongside the General Assembly. It just, unfortunately lost its political salience in that sense. As I alluded to, I think these challenges will be harder in the year ahead. Both big picture and sort of on the details. Big picture wise, we've just seen major powers and emerging powers, as you alluded to, Gabrielle, just seeing less commitment to multilateral cooperation on a range of peace and security issues. You have some countries like Russia and I would say have always looked at global cooperation through the UN with skepticism. You have major powers, China, and I think now the US, that very much see the global body through its own interests and only want to pursue it through its own interests there. And if they move beyond that, they see it as an organization of last resort. You see a range of middle powers that prefer to work through bilateral means or small ad hoc coalitions or neighborhood groups that, are more flexible, have fewer political constraints, but are also less effective and less grounded in the norms and commitments of the UN Charter. And so I don't think we see a move towards multilateral cooperation, even though the challenges that an institution like the UN is ultimately meant to help countries solve are getting worse. I think within the Pact itself, there are specific priorities that, quite frankly, are now dead on arrival. As we highlight in the concept note for this webinar, Security Council reform is unfortunately even further away from materializing than we thought it would be at this time last year. And I don't think any of us had high expectations that, despite the newfound sense of relative optimism, that was even close to being an attainable goal. Washington is now going around saying that they are quite happy with the P5 status quo. And a lot of the enthusiasm last year was precisely based on the US administration creating a tiny opening for possible changes by guaranteeing 2 permanent seats to African countries and as well to a rotating seat for a small island and developing countries. So that unfortunately, which I think you heard a lot of member states this year emphasize, is at the core of the UN's current challenge of legitimacy and effectiveness, is hard to see. disarmament and nuclear non-proliferation commitments, which for many years were a relatively uncontested parts of the multilateral order, especially among major powers, is fraying even further. We've seen in this past year alone conflicts between nuclear powers metastasize to the point that it's no longer unimaginable to think that miscalculation could lead to an unfortunate nuclear crisis. I mean, we even just saw, obviously Israel's strikes on Iran a few months ago were enormously alarming, but also the heightened tensions between India and Pakistan just a few weeks prior to that also highlighted that these, the global non-proliferation order is quite under strain. And lastly, on this point, I'll just say that if we tried to do the Pact for the Future exercise in the coming year in a similar way that we did it in 2023 and 2024, we would have an even less ambitious, less forward-looking and outcome, and perhaps we wouldn't even reach an outcome at all. Two more points, and then I'll wrap up. Despite the overwhelmingly pessimistic attitude I have towards the state of the Pact for the Future right now, I don't mean to dismiss it out of hand. And there are a few elements throughout the document that are already being moved forward by the UN system and some coalitions of member states. One of the benefits of having such a shopping list of global aspirations is that you can always find smaller ingredients that are relatively less controversial, and reflects commitments that member states already wanted to move forward with. Two just for example, one is UN peace operations are undergoing an internal review of trying to help them, overcome a lot of the systemic challenges and political challenges that had defined the past decade. And this exercise, was something that all member states wanted, and the UN is moving forward with it. And this is an opportunity for the system to provide a forward-looking agenda. Similarly, a large part of where we saw progress in the new agenda for peace, the predecessor to the Pact for the Future and the Pact itself, was an expansion of the UN's notion of peace building and more explicitly linking operational conflict prevention with the work and activities of the UN. Member states are pushing for their quinquennial review of the peacebuilding architecture, which happens every 5 years, and a lot of countries really do want to see that process reflect a more ambitious notion of conflict prevention, focusing on governments having a forward-looking strategy to deal with the root causes of violence and to do so in an inclusive manner. That may seem like a pretty small ask of the UN membership, but over the arc of the UN's 20 years in peacebuilding supports, it's actually quite a significant normative evolution. Of course, that will not be adopted unanimously and there will be pushback, but just compared to a few years ago, the language and the terminology that member states are using have advanced in a way that people who research peacebuilding and are practitioners for full time have urged the multilateral system to do so. My final point is that, it's hard to predict what the UN will look like next year or in 5 years. We're expecting certainly more conflictual relations and harder to see the UN being a primary vehicle for peace and sustainable development because, as you explained, Gabrielle, so many countries are moving away from a common understanding of multilateral cooperation. But I do think that there will be opportunities for member states to take advantage of particular moments and to push forward common agendas. And it's good that there is now a very long list of commitments that all member states have said, this is good that we all agree on these things. We have common language. We've negotiated these ideas. We have a sense of where we were 2 years ago, a year ago, on paper and endorsed by the General Assembly. So I view this as a menu in the near to medium term future that when there are political openings for reasons we may not be able to see, on issues we may not be able to identify which will happen first and when, that there is a list of commitments and solutions already on the table that enterprising and entrepreneurial member states who can work in different coalitions that can expend domestic and international political capital to focus on these priorities now have an actual roadmap ahead of them. So, the Pact for the Past may be the moment, but I think some of the commitments made can actually help member states chart some new pathways for the future.
Great. Thank you very much, Daniel, especially because you stick completely to your time. So you really made it very, very well. Also, your intervention remind me of a thing that a friend always says to me. She says, "Oh, you don't like a picture, you don't like how you appear in the picture, don't worry. Wait 2 years. In 2 years' time, you will see yourself very nice." And that reminds me of your comments on the Pact for the Future. Maybe in that moment we weren't very happy. Now we're quite happy. Probably in a year time, we will see it fabulously. We will say, whoa, what we had, remember it? So maybe that'll be, we'll see. Thank you very much. And now we have Gretchen Baldwin. Thank you again, Gretchen. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Pablo. I really like that analogy. I'm gonna commit that to memory. Thanks so much to Pablo and to Claudia for doing so much coordination work on this. Thanks to Fundipao for its partnership with CIPRI on this event. And thanks so much to Gabrielle and Daniel for your interventions. It's lightly intimidating to follow these two, but I think it's very cool to see how sort of all of our perspectives fit together, but sort of build different pieces of the current state of things. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the main challenges, in my view, for peace building broadly. I'll bring in a little bit on the Pact for the Future, though Daniel's covered it really well. And then I'll sort of close with an attempt at optimism, at least, but difficult these days. So, I mean, in short, the main challenges that we're seeing to peace building at the moment largely stem from a lack of support for or interest in peace building from actors that have typically provided those things. That is first and foremost an issue of material support for cooperation and non-military means for managing, resolving, and preventing conflicts. But more specifically, I'm going to go into a bit more detail on 4 key challenges that I and my colleagues at CIPRI have identified as major issues facing global conflict management, and all 4 link quite clearly, in my opinion, to the problems facing long-term sustainable peace and peace building specifically. The issues are, just to sort of preview, militarization, deinstitutionalization and reliance on short-term solutions to conflicts, declining trust in governance, and states' repression and consolidation of power. And just as a note, most of what I'll be sharing is part of CIPRI's new Geopolitics of Conflict Management project. And it builds on findings from 2 recent workshops that we held in Dakar, Senegal, which Daniel was present for, and Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. So first on militarization, I mean, I don't think it's news to anyone here that we're seeing incredible increases in military spending the world over. And while military expenditure does not automatically mean that a country or organization will militarize, the 2 are very often correlated. Just a note that when I refer to militarization, I'm referring to a preference by states to address perceived threats and engage in conflict by military means over other tools, as well as prioritizing military funding over other areas, such as funding social programs. Notably, the Pact for the Future does talk about this rising military expenditure. It notes that it's worrying, given the potential negative impacts on investments in sustainable development and sustaining peace. It also links this really importantly, and this gets back to what Daniel was just saying. Rising military expenditure and massive military expenditure undercuts addressing root drivers and causes of conflict, and it can have a serious negative effect on promotion of cultures of peace, for example. The Pact for the Future also notes the importance of ensuring that military spending does not compromise investment in sustainable development and building sustainable peace, but we know that it very often does. So Despite this acknowledgement by the international system, the multilateral world order of last year, as almost every region of the world is seeing increasing military expenditure right now, we're also seeing investment in non-military peace building and prevention sharply declining. So there's one report, for example, that estimates that 2025 will end with a 34% drop in global investment in non-military peace and security, which is just massive. I think an interesting maybe counterexample to this is, and this comes from my CIPRI colleagues' research on military expenditure, but the example is that of South Africa, which recently cut its military budget. I want to say last year was the 4th year in a row. Cut its military budget with an explicit policy goal to redirect spending toward economic growth and social services. So, 4 years is not that long in the grand scheme of a state's sort of budgetary priorities, but it is, I think, an interesting experiment to sort of follow. And it's quite rare in our global political landscape, especially with this sort of rising competition, geopolitical competition that my colleagues have alluded to. Military spending increases also reflect the fact that countries perceive a high probability of military conflict in the future, which incentivizes the choice of militarized conflict management approaches and can ultimately become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So without diversified conflict management, development, and peace-building approaches, the law of the instrument, which states that when one only has a hammer, everything looks like a nail, this can lead to widespread securitization and militarization over peace-building approaches. And while military operations and the use of force can effectively address short-term security threats at times, they must happen in conjunction with other conflict management tools and conflict resolution tools in order to meaningfully move toward the sustainable peace called for in the Pact for the Future. The capability to deploy troops and military technology or use force is often the focus of peace and security, but states' capacities to refrain from using force, to exercise restraint, to pursue disarmament, or otherwise focus on peacemaking are critical to sustainable conflict management, resolution, and prevention. One important way forward for global peace and security is to better recognize the limitations of military might and redirect political will and material resources to addressing root causes of conflict. Again, Daniel said it perfectly in his remarks as well. So the second major challenge that we're seeing to peace building is deinstitutionalization and reliance on short-term solutions. And again, this gets at a lot of what Gabrielle was also saying, this sort of trend away from multilateralism, or this sort of in-between period we find ourselves in with multiple systems at once. So I'll be quite brief as they've already covered quite a lot, but we are seeing this worrying trend toward trading out collective security arrangements for unilateral, bilateral, or ad hoc ones. There's a temptation to seek quick fixes, which tend to be by military means, as I've said. So these quick fixes to protracted conflicts, liquidity crises, humanitarian catastrophes, and economic pressures. But the quick fixes divert attention and resources from long-term solutions and capacity investment, and they push those burdens then on to future generations. So some have highlighted the need for coexistence between longitudinal multilateral systems and shorter-lived ad hoc sort of focused coalitions. But currently there's far less political will behind multilateralism. So we're really only seeing these short burst, often militarized, highly militarized responses to conflict, attempts at conflict resolution, which are really unsustainable. Alongside this, we're seeing states turning inward to focus only on their own security and maybe the borders with their neighbors. And this is leaving a security vacuum in much of the world that's likely to grow. So addressing the tension between quick fixes and long-term investment requires institutions to be adaptive at a level that's frankly unrealistic, given the current political and financial strains on civilian conflict management and peace building. So my sincere hope is that we do start to see a reinvestment in multilateralism and collective security, even if, it looks different from what we're accustomed to. So the third challenge that I'll talk about is declining trust in governance. So another serious challenge to international peace and security at the moment is the notable erosion of trust among populations, and that's trust that governments will meet their needs or overcome corruption in particular. Trust between states is also eroding, as well as people's trust or confidence that international and regional institutions will operate effectively. Where mistrust and dissatisfaction with governments have resulted in citizens taking to the streets, such as the United States, Kenya, Serbia, Indonesia, Nepal, and elsewhere, sub-state or international institutions can sometimes be seen as more trustworthy. So this is a potential small window of opportunity for the United Nations, though I would also caution a light touch, given that the UN does not always enjoy a positive perception the world over. So whatever the root cause, and it certainly differs based on context, lack of trust fundamentally undermines human security, legitimacy, and the effectiveness of conflict management tools such as mediation or negotiation, security sector reform, political transitions, or the protection of civilians. And all of these are absolutely essential for sustainable peace and peace building. And the sort of paradox that we face is that trust is both a prerequisite for the success of these tools, but it's also achieved through their successful implementation. And then finally, the fourth challenge that we're seeing is state repression and consolidation of power. So the shift toward these ad hoc militarized interventions that I mentioned earlier, as well as a focus on states' national security over the collective, has been compounded by ongoing threats to global civil society in particular. NGOs are critical to a more equitable distribution of power across multiple actors. They improve grassroots representation and help to enforce accountability for states, particularly around normative frameworks. The inclusion of global civil society and international peace and security has helped to bring the experiences of those most directly affected by violent conflict and insecurity to the attention of decision makers and policy spaces. But now we're seeing this trend across much of the world for state consolidation of power, which is sort of wresting access and inclusion away from civil society and civilian populations and threatening that representation and accountability. I am not going to cite the study because I don't want to misspeak on which organization put it out, but there is a statistic that in the last 3 decades, more than 130 countries have placed restrictions on international and foreign funded NGOs. And this contributes to a chilling effect on advocacy and activism all over the world. In addition, the recent drastic cuts in official development assistance and other non-military tools for conflict management, resolution, and prevention have put the future of many small NGOs and service providers in jeopardy. And in the grand scheme of things, these organizations are not huge. They're not, they could be cruelly described as sort of a blip in the global landscape, but they're extremely, extremely important for the populations that they serve. So this regression aligns with a global trend for democratic backsliding exacerbated by intimidation, militarization, surveillance, and mis and disinformation by state actors that are working to consolidate and hold on to their power. So I would venture to say the near antithesis of meaningful peace-building efforts. So I do want to attempt to end on a bit of a sort of what can be done, how can we move ahead? So I just want to highlight 3 very short points where we might see potential improvement toward peace building successes. So first, diversified budgets at the state level. So this sort of the review of the peace building architecture Daniel's talking about, this sort of push to have states focus more on root causes of conflict. Easier said than done to do the convincing, but we know that focusing funding on social services, on education services, on healthcare does help to move states toward sustainable peace. It does help to create a more peaceful, more equitable future. So looking toward demilitarizing or avoiding militarization, sort of propelling investment in the kinds of state services that do address those root causes of conflict. Second, I would call for international solidarity with and support for civil society. I think it's more critical than ever before. And related to this, I think support from friendly states for normative frameworks like the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda, international humanitarian law, the protection of civilians agenda, youth, peace, and security. All of these are really important to address issues caused by militarization and this sort of fragmentation that we're seeing. So I would really encourage a continued sort of support for those frameworks. And finally, while collective security is suffering a crisis of confidence at the moment, there are coalitions coming together to try to meet the gaps caused by the retreat of states like the United States. And these new actors may struggle to hold power on the international stage at the moment, but their efforts to retain certain multilateral gains are worth following. And I'll be curious to see sort of where they fit into this, again, sort of overlapping types of world order that we're seeing now. Yeah, and I'll stop there, and I look forward to questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gretchen. That was very interesting as well, and very complementary to the other two presentations. So thank you, all of you. You really focus on different topics, all of them related with the main topic that we're speaking about. There's a question and answers space that you can fill in. Before we get into it, you can write down your questions, but I wanted to ask our three speakers just a few issues that maybe between you can comment or have any idea or any comment on the others, but related more or less with all you've said, and also bringing it to the reality nowadays and what is happening. Every day we're having images on Gaza Strip, what is going on, to what extent international law is being violated on very different ways. The Pact for the Future spoke of protection of all civilians, also of making humanitarian aid, make it arrive to whoever is needed. To what extent do you think that affects the countries, and to what extent it affects the trust of the people on the international institutions, on the way international order is managed, on the way you can influence your government on doing things or not? Maybe it's a little small question on our day-to-day, but some of the people that are watching probably find it worth. Any of you can react on that. Gretchen, I see you already did. So
Sure. Happy to just say a couple quick things on that, and thanks for the question. I will just share that in these two workshops that we've held this year, Gaza has come up many times, as you can imagine, but it has specifically been raised as a turning point. I want to be careful how I say this. I would not say that it has singularly caused this like loss of trust, right? But it has massively accelerated a loss of trust in people's belief that they can influence their government's policy decisions. It has done enormous damage to belief in trust in systems like international humanitarian law. I would venture a guess that it has continued to erode trust in the UN, because the UN has proved to be so ineffective in this moment, largely due to the veto power in the P5 and the US's total abuse of that veto power in this case. So yeah, it's just been a really devastating flashpoint there. And I had one more thing that I wanted to say about that, but it's not coming to me, so I'll pass to Gabrielle.
Oh, very, very quickly. I mean, Gretchen has already said it perfectly. The idea of a world after Gaza is something to take into account, and you know, sometimes, and this might be just my position, but sometimes I think it as a lecturer in international relations when I address my students, right? And we try to explain them and talk about institutional design, the norms, the international law, all the mechanisms the international community has in order to manage peace and security. And you look at their faces and it's like, you know, this is very fine, but I've just, you know, turned my TV on, I've just read the newspaper, and they're not saying the same. So there's something going a bit awkward at this moment, right? And this is precisely the idea, right? That formally the law is still there, formally the institution is there, but the level of political credibility, trust, and collective engagement is completely drowned, and this is very problematic. And again, we might like all of us to think if there's, illiberal tendency has come from the periphery or from the center at the very same time, right? Which is one of the weird, I would say, things to negotiate, right? There has been all of these debates about watch out the rise of the illiberal powers, watch out the rise of the illiberal powers. And this is true and it's part of the story, but then you have the liberal center sometimes also performing some very problematic illiberal mechanisms in conflict management and migration and conflict management, right? And it's something to keep in mind as well.
Thanks. Just a few quick points. One, you mentioned in your framing question, Pablo, the issue of protecting civilians and how much harder that is for the international system these days, precisely because governments are more brazen with their efforts to permit or to conduct violence against their own populations for very narrow political goals. Crisis Group, we're an organization with colleagues in 35 countries around the world. We have experts on every major area or conflict context in the world. And I say this because most of my colleagues don't have much of a touch point with the UN in their work in each of these countries, and those that do, maybe in a country like South Sudan, where there's been a large UN presence for decades or something similar, they tell us nonstop that, the UN is often far less of a credible and relevant political actor than we in New York like to think. But so many populations around the world, first and foremost, associate the UN with protection. And when they lose hope in national institutions or, community protection, that if they see a UN representative, whether fairly or unfairly, they see the UN as a provider of last resort on protection. And the fact that the organization, for so many reasons, struggles to do that effectively, and that would be an entirely different seminar or dissertation to go into why that happens. But just to underscore that point is that for normal civilians, the UN is a body to provide them protection when they have no other recourse. So the fact that that is so much harder in all these different contexts around the world has done considerable damage to the organization's legitimacy and reputation. The second point, talking about violations of international law, I think Gretchen and Gabrielle covered the points about Gaza incredibly well. Just to say that Ukraine has also been a massive turning point for the system as well, because we've seen that one of the fundamental principles of the UN, which is, protecting of a country's territorial integrity, is now a principle that is under threat by a P5 power. And it is one that at varying points since 2022 has been tested and prodded, and countries around the world have issued varying levels of support or indifference to that principle, depending whether they have their own territorial claims or aspirations to possibly launch incursions into a neighbor's territory. And that has been central to a lot of the political debates around what role a multilateral or multinational assistance to any kind of political progress to halt the war between Russia and Ukraine would ultimately entail. And so I think you see a lot of countries now at the UN, especially those from the so-called global south, basically anyone outside of Europe, quite frankly, now has to weigh the realities of, do you support what kind of peace would you ultimately support, especially if there are questions about whether Ukraine gets to retain the entirety of its territory. And the third point, one last part on international law and Gaza and the future of the UN. What, beyond the politics in the council, which we could spend another hour talking about, what makes this issue so devastating for the future of multilateral cooperation is two things. One is that so much of what the Palestinian people and the nascent Palestinian states or the idea of a Palestinian state and the rights of Palestinians, has depended entirely on the UN since 1948 for assistance, for a political horizon, for legal and refugee rights. That is all an order that has been enshrined and protected through UN institutions, conventions, agreements. And so that makes the second point even more harder to grapple with, is that throughout this war, Israel has very much made the UN an intentional target of its war efforts, whether that is the hundreds of UN aid workers, very often Palestinian citizens working for UNRWA, the most deadly aid operation in the UN's history, whether it is the fact that Israel has taken a very blatant and brazen PR campaign against the UN through and use its legal infrastructure to try and minimize, if not entirely eject, the UN from delivering aid and basic rights, not only in Gaza, but in parts of the West Bank. And then to actually, try and diminish and politically reject everything that's happened in, on the New York side politically around the UN's role, not only on securing the rights of Palestinian refugees or being an anchor for discussions about a political settlement, but even just looking at what's happened now with the two-state solution conference and the New York Declaration, and actively and brazenly, rejecting so much of the world's large political movements to halt the fighting. And the last point I want to say is other countries who have an antagonistic view of the UN will look at how Israel has treated the organization, whether explicitly or indirectly, see the lack of punitive response they've gotten from other countries, and get ideas that will be even more damaging to the future of multilateral cooperation.
If I could just come in just very quickly with a final point, I wanted to also note that I think when we think about sort of the movement away from these kind of traditional multilateral systems and faith in those systems, the example of Gaza could be, and it's not a positive example, but when we think about sort of the formation of new coalitions and where states might continue to place some degree of faith as far as international institutions go, I would just want to note South Africa's ICJ case against Israel. That was a really interesting case of sort of a lot of critiques of the international justice system are that they are disproportionately applied to so-called global South countries, right? And this is an example of a so-called global South country actually, placing a great deal of faith in that court. It hasn't come to a lot, so there's an argument there that it's largely symbolic, but I think that's an interesting point, and I would be curious about sort of how we see that continuing in the future. And then I also just want to note, the recently formed Hague Group, which is made up of 8 also global South countries, specifically looking to form a coalition largely out of frustration about the lack of action in sort of P5 traditional powerful countries. The Hague Group has formed in order to sort of bring solidarity and bring coalition from a different part of the world in looking toward prosecuting violations of IHL. And it's specific to the Gaza case right now and Israel's actions in Gaza, but I will also be very interested to see whether that sort of continues, whether there is momentum behind that, whether it begins to be applied to other conflicts that maybe are not getting responses from institutions like the UN anymore. So just to note that there is an interesting sort of angle on this of how new coalitions form and sort of where states replace their faith, right, as they lose faith in other institutions.
Thank you very much for your interactions and your answers. Now I will collect a bit of the questions that have been written down on the chat. At least part of them. One of them goes, I presume, more to Daniel or Gabriel, but goes about in which way can we see real participation of young people on issues like climate, technology, or conflict. That would be the most interesting for them. Also, another question, interesting one, has to do with to what extent the past international agreements, I presume it's focusing on SDG and Agenda 2030, can help Pact for the future and really reach their objectives. When I read about the Pact for the Future at the beginning of it, I remember I was thinking of, well, it's kind of they're playing it again. It's that Casablanca song, no? Isn't it? Play it again, Sam, because it's mostly, not all of it, but mostly remembers very much of the language or other parts of SDG and Agenda 2030. And for Gabriel, I would like to ask about to what extent expectations on Global South being able of really to transform in one way or another what it seems to be a quite negative future for the Pact and for multilateralism in general.
Shall I start with this last one very quickly?
Okay, great.
Now, one of the issues with and I think Drescher and Daniel also pointed at that throughout their interventions. One of the issues with the idea of the Global South is that we have multiple politics in the Global South, right? It's not the same to talk about South Africa's initiative than to talk about Turkey's management of Nagorno-Karabakh, or I don't know, even people that include Russia in the Global South, if that's even a possibility, as an imperial power, I mean, to think about authoritarian politics in the Global South, right? So, as far as multilateralism is concerned, there is, on the one hand, one interesting bit, which is that several countries in the Global South, the so-called Global South, especially those that are not necessarily great powers or regional powers or aspiring global powers, still see the UN and still use the UN as a forum for their political concerns, economic concerns, development concerns. You've got different groups of countries in the United Nations that at least try to dynamize these kind of politics that go beyond more north and global north perspective. So in terms of multilateralism, there is possibility for a renewed understanding of multilateralism. But one of the things that always appear in these conversations is that the idea of renewing multilateralism, the idea of making multilateralism again very, very strong and very central to world politics, to me must not mean that we return to a very Western-centric multilateralism, in a sense that some very Western American-centered multilateral worldviews must also understand that there is something there to negotiate with other powers, the Global South, and the idea also of non-Western countries demanding certain space for their own politics, their own interests, their own necessities in terms of development or elsewhere. So yes, renewed multilateralism, but a multilateralism that also expands the way it understands cooperation and global politics, but because otherwise it was still very, very, very centered around the northern hemisphere.
I'll jump in on a few of the questions. I don't think I can beat Gabriel's analysis there, so I won't try to. On the colleague who asked about youth engagement beyond tokenism, look, there are two ways that we see this youth engagement happening more broadly at the UN. One is that there's an effort to bring what what different youth communities and different youth leaders in all parts of the world are doing to the global stage. And second, there are efforts to try and bring youth representatives and voices into the actual decision-making processes and deliberations of the UN. My personal view is that the former is probably a more effective way of going, which is encouraging and having, I hate saying youth because it sounds so generic and sort of a large mass of individual with many different ideas, interests, all sort of criteria understood. But the UN is a state-based institution full of states with very often conservative attitudes towards inclusion and participation and sort of broader approaches to decision-making processes within their own systems, but certainly within a multilateral system. So I personally think that while it's important to bring in lots of different perspectives into multilateral debates and decision-making processes, I see very limited returns for the amount of effort that goes into it, and with the amount of challenges of having to select individual youth representatives, understanding their own political agendas and interests, and trying to see whether they're authentic or valuable representatives and to feed into those conversations, versus having ways to open up the UN space to bring people who are already doing the work and making positive impacts in their communities and innovating new ideas and bringing those ideas and socializing them within the UN space. Because that way you're putting fewer constraints on the individuals and the communities that are doing this work and actually trying to, allow them to do what they need to do and just sort of more or less socialize that among diplomats and UN officials. I will say that, a few years ago, the UN has first had a youth envoy and now has a youth office within the Secretariat. To be honest, I don't know very much about their work, and it's not a part of the system that Crisis Group interacts with regularly. But the mere fact that member states agreed to turn this into an office and bring it into the formal structure is not a bad sign. So, again, that may be an unsatisfactory answer, but I think it's better to just bring youth communities to the UN and not try the very difficult effort of making space within formal institutions for youth representatives, if that makes sense. On the colleague asked a question about veto reform, I think, or is that correct?
There's one veto, and there's another one on past agreements.
Okay. On past agreements, I think the right way to go is sort of what I alluded to in my opening remarks, which is for coalitions of countries to pick the parts of the pact that matter most for them and to work on policy pathways and political movements that push for those specific reforms to be implemented and not try and launch a massive campaign around the entirety of the Pact for the Future and the need for an all or nothing type of approach. I think the Sustainable Development Goals tried to do a halfway point between those two strategies, because on the one hand, the SDGs are carrying on a multi-decades notion of development goals and the need for having an all-encompassing and holistic approach for international cooperation on development. But at the same time, if you look at the targets and indicators in the SDGs, countries prioritize what they like more than others. They get assistance for those that they find more palatable or see as a more urgent priority for their own countries, whether that is on health or clean water or peace and education. There are lots of different ways to go about it. And I don't think the Pact for the Future will be a good sell if you're trying to sell the Pact. But if you're talking about a better way to do conflict prevention or the need for, more focus on nuclear disarmament, those have long-standing coalitions of countries that are behind those individual ideas that may be less willing to put skin in the game if you wrap it up in the notion of a pact for the future. And then, I think a colleague mentioned about the parallels to the League of Nations in moments of crises. I mean, yes, there is a reality that the crises the UN faces are quite significant. I would push back slightly from saying that the UN is going to go by the way of the League of Nations, both because of the design of the organization and precisely a way to, keep everyone involved, but also just the institution itself. The organization has a far more elaborate, spread out, and powerful set of institutions that work towards common goals than the League of Nations, which was primarily a member state forum, ever did. So I don't think we'll see the UN go by the way of the League of Nations, even if I'm not by any means trying to dismiss the serious credibility crisis and the perception and the challenges the organization faces.
Thank you, Daniel, for all your answers. A patron of Fundipau lost the line, couldn't get online because light problems, and she wrote to me by WhatsApp a question. So allow me to make it through the questions and answers. Particularly, maybe Gretchen and you, Daniel, can answer that. It focuses on to what extent Action 25 of the Future Pact, the Pact for the Future, referring to nuclear non-proliferation, could be one of those topics that you say that maybe on certain topics we can find more collaboration, maybe not great headlines on very big issues, but on very quite small ones, and trying to find collaboration on these areas. She was particularly asking for that. If you can make comments on it, any of you, but maybe Gretchen and Daniel especially.
I can just quickly say I should not say anything definitive on nuclear non-proliferation. It's not my area. I can say that this is an area that there's still so much civil society activity behind it, right? So I do think that insofar as there's infrastructure globally to push for non-proliferation and to push for continued disarmament, I would say that it's a very good area to form coalitions around. But I can't speak to the politics of that and what sort of that might cost states. So I don't know if Daniel or Gabrielle has anything that they'd like to beef that up with.
Sure. For this, I'll draw on the work of my colleagues. A few months ago, or not even a few months ago, 2 months ago, our president, Dr. Comfort Arrow, published an op-ed calling for a need for states to focus more strongly on the needs of reinforcing the nuclear non-proliferation architecture, because it is under strain, and I'll drop the link in the chat, I think, afterwards. But I think the argument was twofold about what needs to be done. One is that nuclear powers need to invest in more stable and clear lines of communication with one another, just as we're seeing escalatory risks are so high. And one of the defining features of the Cold War era and why we averted nuclear catastrophe on multiple occasions is because states actually had clear lines of communication and decision-making processes within their own governments that would minimize the possible risk of unintended miscalculation and escalation because of the lack of communication and not knowing your rival, whatever word you want to use, your antagonist's decision-making processes and intentions. So that, there are very few situations right now, and, crisis groups' MO in many ways is to encourage dialogue among states with competing interests. There are very few reasons why it's impossible for nuclear powers to improve how they communicate with one another, especially under times of strain. I mean, even in a context like India and Pakistan, past crises between those countries have been de-escalated precisely because of these types of channels of communication between maybe not necessarily their political leaders, but especially among their military institutions. In the long run, there is a need for political commitment to the nuclear non-proliferation treaties. Part of the problem is that, you have leaders in Russia and the US that are quite antagonistic towards multilateral cooperation. So I don't expect there to be new additions or innovations to the existing architecture, but I do think there is a world where we can see countries get together to try and protect what's left of the existing non-proliferation treaty order. And I think the key locus to watch in this conversation is what's happening with Iran right now, with the now sort of imposition of the snapback sanctions under the UN designation. Our colleagues on our Iran program had long sort of seen that the Iranian leadership would be possibly taking a major escalatory step if they withdrew from the NPT. And so far, we are not getting signals that they have made a decision to do so. And we think, part of that may be for domestic reasons, but we also sense that there is a reality where, Iran's allies understand the significance of the NPT and that, that infrastructure does a lot of good for everyone. So I don't know all this to answer the colleague's question. I don't have a sense of whether there is a new coalition to make it a more expansive era of the NPT and the nuclear non-proliferation sort of architecture that exists in the multilateral system. But I do think there is a large coalition of countries that see the value in the current system and would not want it to fray anymore.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And sorry, Gretchen, for asking you something. Sorry, I should have known your expertise. Anyhow, I don't know if you have any other comments. Doesn't seem to me. So once again, I really want to thank you. I think it was a very, let's say, dark diagnosis from all of you, but you also showed some room for optimism and for action. There's ways that we can improve our world. There's enormous difficulties to do such a thing, obviously, but that shouldn't make us just not try it. Once again, it's been a pleasure. And at this moment, we will finish the webinar. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you,
It's been a
Pablo,
pleasure.
Gretchen, Daniel. Pleasure.
Everyone. Bye.
Bye.